In recent years, Russia has shown an aggressive nature not seen since the end of the Cold War, with its president, Vladimir Putin, clearly signaling he means to remake Russia back into its former Cold War-era superpowerdom. The US and its allies, meanwhile, have pushed back with economic sanctions over Russia's invasion of Ukraine and by bolstering their military readiness within the Baltic States area. But who would ultimately win in a showdown between the US and Russia, and what might that war look like? As always, the rules of this war include no use of nuclear weapons, as a nuclear exchange would render any war moot and result in total global devastation. For this specific wargame, though, the US will not be able to call upon its numerous allies nor use their territory, pitting it on its own against the Russian bear. Russia has a little less than half the population of the United States, with 144,554,993 people, versus the US's 324,527,000. This ratio translates into total available manpower as well, with Russia having 34,765,736 civilians fit for military duty, and the US having 73,270,043. In their active duty militaries, Russia has approximately 800,000 personnel, while the US has just over 1.2 million. Through sheer numbers alone, it's clear the US has a sizable advantage, but that advantage is compounded when you take into account that roughly two-thirds of Russia's military is made up of conscripts versus the US's all-volunteer force. Russia's military conscripts are notoriously undertrained and poorly equipped, and suffer from morale issues, all of which would come into play in ways that this war game can't properly model, but would have very serious real-world implications for Russia. In the air, the US has a staggering advantage, with a total of 12,100 combat aircraft versus Russia's 4,042. The bulk of the US's air fleet is made up of multi-role strike aircraft, giving American forces flexibility in planning missions, as the same plane may fight a strike mission one day and act as a fighter escort the next. Russia has only recently begun to design aircraft with the same multi-role capability, and today the total count is 2,062 multi-role aircraft for the US versus 428 for Russia. In dedicated fighters, Russia outnumbers the US nearly 2-to-1, with 629 fighter aircraft versus the US's 388. This holds true for dedicated strike or air support aircraft as well, with Russia having 752 attack aircraft versus the US's 470. Russia's limitation in multi-role aircraft means that as war progresses and losses are incurred, it will be harder and harder for Russian air forces to launch effective sorties, while the US could absorb these losses and maintain the flexibility needed to launch different types of sorties effectively. The US also has an advantage in technology levels, with Russia about a decade or two behind US aircraft, with only the Su-34 and Su-35 having comparable systems technology to most US aircraft. Though, unfortunately for Russia, it only fields about 120 or so of its most modern airframes. US missiles are also on the whole technologically superior to Russian missiles, with the modern R-77-1 just starting to see mass proliferation in the Russian air forces, while the US is equipped with modern AIM-120D and near-modern AIM-120C and AIM-9X. Where Russia could make up that technological and numbers shortfall, however, is in its ground-based SAM air defenses, which vastly outnumber and outclass the US's own SAM capabilities. While the US fields the Patriot air defense missile battery, Russia is equipped with the modern and fearsome S-300 and S-400 systems, which sport a range over double of the Patriot, up to 400 kilometers versus 160 kilometers. On the sea, the US also outnumbers Russia, with a total naval force of 436 ships versus Russia's 313 ships. Russia also suffers disadvantage from the fact that the bulk of its fleet is made up of aging Soviet-era ships. The bulk of US naval power is in its supercarriers, of which it operates 11 versus Russia's 1, though as recent action in Syria has shown, Russia's Admiral Kuznetsov is barely combat-worthy and is currently undergoing repair and refitting operations expected to last 3 years. On land, Russia has the clear numbers advantage, with a total of 20,050 tanks versus the US's 8,848, though most of Russia's armored forces are made up of the 1970s T-72 with 8,700 in service. Even with some modern upgrades, they would not stand a chance against the US's M1 and M1A2 Abrams, which are nearly completely modernized and outclass Russia's most numerous tanks, the T-72, T-55, and the T-80 in firepower, armor, and sensors. Russia's most modern tanks include the T-90 and T-14 Armata, yet together they only number 570 total, not nearly enough to go head-to-head versus the US's Abrams. The one overwhelming advantage Russia has over the US is in the amount of artillery it is equipped with, 14,533 versus the US's 3,269. So, though Russia may lose control of the skies eventually, it has a good chance of still giving its ground troops the fire support they would desperately need in a fight against the US. So, how would a potential war play out? With no hope of controlling the seas and not enough heavy-lift transport ships to launch an invasion across either the Atlantic or the Pacific, Russia would opt to wage a defensive war. Without NATO support, the US could not invade via major land routes through Germany or the Baltics, forcing it into an amphibious assault of Russia. Though the US Navy outmatches the Russian Navy, Russian naval forces would opt to operate close to shore, where they can remain within range of coastal fire support and aircraft. This would also make it easier for Russian ships to resupply and refit, meaning that they could get back into the fight faster than American ships, whom would have to make the long trip back home to either the East Coast or naval bases in the Pacific. At the outset of the war, the US would seek to first degrade both the Russian Navy and Air Force before attempting any coastal assault. Russia's biggest weakness would be its sheer size, forcing it to spread its air defenses across the entirety of its coast to prevent incursions by the American aircraft. While access via carrier-based planes would be limited during most of the year due to sea ice, bomber aircraft operating from Alaskan air bases could launch strikes across the North Pole or west into the Kamchatka region. Russian bombers could attempt to do the same, but ultimately both sides would see most of their bomber fleet destroyed within days. Russian bombers would be lost to overwhelming number of American interceptors, and US bombers would be downed by an equally overwhelming number of Russian SAM batteries. In the end, strategic bombers would play a small role in the opening weeks of the war and not be worth sacrificing, with the exception of US's B-2 stealth bombers, which would likely enjoy a degree of success, although with only 20 in its inventory, the US would eventually deplete its numbers as well. The bulk of the US's initial war effort would be an air campaign waged by its carrier-based strike aircraft, goading Russian air defenses to engage so that American fighters could begin thinning out the Russian fighter fleet. With superior technology, the US would enjoy a favorable kill ratio, but Russian aircraft would be operating defensively and supported by ground-based radar and SAM, negating American technological advantage and equalizing that kill ratio. This is where American numbers would tip the odds for victory in the skies, as though it could not commit all of its aircraft at once due to a lack of nearby bases, it could fairly quickly replace its carrier-based aircraft losses to continue the fight until exhausting the Russian air forces. American carriers, however, would be hunted by Russian submarines, which would pose a formidable threat. Russian subs would be limited in their effectiveness by the large number of anti-submarine warfare platforms the US employs, but would most likely be effective in sinking at least a third of the US carrier fleet. The losses of entire supercarriers could also mean a loss of 80 to 120 aircraft as well, further helping Russia equalize the numbers advantage enjoyed by the US. After weeks or possibly months of an air and naval campaign, the US may attempt a land invasion, though with American transports limited to a ferry total of approximately 20,000 troops per day, any amphibious assault would likely be crushed by the overwhelming number of Russian defenders. Instead, it's highly likely that the US would simply choose to blockade Russia and lean on European nations to embargo it as well. Any actual invasion of Russian territory would prove disastrous for the U.S., and though over time superior numbers, technology, and an economy approximately 3 times bigger than Russia's could make an invasion feasible, it would only come at a staggering number of casualties for the U.S. Rather than accept such high casualties, the U.S. could simply sit back and slowly strangle the Russian economy while continuing to wear out its air defenses, to the point that it could strike deeper and deeper into Russian territory. Eventually, this war of attrition would be enough to force Russia to the negotiating table. Ultimately, victory would go to the United States of America. Although unable to threaten Moscow with troops on the ground, such victory would end up largely meaningless with few, if any, concessions granted by Russia, making the entire war largely a pointless endeavor on both sides.